Once upon a time, there lived a woman who trained her daughter to be a thief. Her name was Udodi, and she believed that true success could only come to those bold enough to seize their own destiny, even if it meant snatching it from the hands of others. Her daughter Dumebi was an extremely beautiful young woman, the kind of beauty that made men trip over themselves just to have a word with her. Dumebi used this to her advantage. Each man that she met ended up losing something valuable: phones, cars, money, and even landed properties. Through her theft and deception, Dumebi upgraded her mother's life. Udodi, who once lived in an old rat-infested room in the slums, now lounged in a luxurious mansion with white pillars and imported chandeliers. The grand mansion stood proudly in the choicest part of town, a house Dumebi had stolen from a wealthy tech entrepreneur who she met online that trusted her with money to buy a home while he was away abroad. Dumebi bought the house, but in her mother's name. She vanished, not caring what her actions did to these men who were not only left heartbroken but also wrecked. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in the bank, but Udodi did not stop pushing her daughter. There's no limit to what you can achieve, she always said to Dumebi, who she forced to keep stealing. That evening, Dumebi went out to meet one of the men who she had been chatting with for days. She arrived at his house and met the young man who had just finished preparing dinner for her. Vanessa, he said with a smile on his face, calling her by the fake name that she had given to him as he ushered her towards the dining table. The house was stunning: smart lights, sleek furniture, expensive art. Everything about it screamed wealth, the kind of wealth that had no clue how to hide itself. Dinner was spaghetti and lamb chops, served on plates that looked like they had never been touched by anyone who grew up hungry. Dumebi smiled sweetly, complimenting the food. She let him pour her wine as she laughed at his jokes, a little louder than she needed to. He was young, too young to be this rich, but naive too, the perfect mix for her. Dumebi kept the conversation light, flirting just enough, leaning in when he spoke about his work. Tech, crypto, stocks. He talked about algorithms. She nodded like she understood. All she needed to know was where he kept the money. An hour passed, and he excused himself to take a call. Dumebi rose quietly. She had done this more times than she could count. She slipped out of the dining room and moved down the hallway. First door was locked. The second door was his home office. Bingo, she whispered as she stepped inside. She threw open all the drawers and came across huge stacks of money in foreign currency. A Rolex watch also sat in the corner next to a brown envelope filled with documents. Dumebi did not need everything, just enough to make it sting. She emptied all the money into her purse and grabbed the envelope. As she turned to leave, her elbow knocked over a ceramic sculpture on the shelf. It fell, shattered as the sound echoed like a gunshot. "Vanessa!" His voice called out sharply from down the hall. Her chest tightened as she began to run. She slipped through the hallway and darted towards the front door. The young man came running after her, barefoot and confused. "Wait, what are you doing?" Dumebi did not stop. She flung the door open and bolted out into the night, heels in her hand, as her purse was clutched tightly against her body. "Stop her! Thief!" he yelled into the street, waving his hands frantically. Two estate security men standing near the gate turned, confused at first until they saw Dumebi sprinting like her life depended on it. They chased after her as she turned into the side street, narrowly missing a parked SUV. Her heart thundered, her breath burned, her legs screamed. One of the guards was fast, too fast for her. He almost caught her by the scarf that she wore, but she yanked it off and kept going. Dumebi disappeared down a narrow road, jumped over a short fence and landed into an abandoned compound. She hid behind a large water tank, panting, her chest heaving as sweat soaked through her dress. She waited. 1 minute, 2, 5. The guards did not find her. When the coast was clear, she slipped out the back of the compound, hailed a tricycle and disappeared into the night. By the time she arrived home, Her legs were cut and bruised, and her hands were still shaking. She had barely escaped. The money was in her purse, but it didn't feel like a win. It felt like she just drowned. The door creaked as she entered the house. Quiet, dark, almost still. She hoped her mother had gone to bed, but to her dismay, she hadn't. Her mother Udodi sat in the living room like royalty, sipping wine with a wicked smile on her face. Dumebi tried to walk past her, but Udodi's voice sliced through the silence as she began to speak. "You almost got caught, didn't you?" Dumebi froze. Udodi did not wait for an answer. She stood up, walked slowly to the drawer and pulled out a single photograph. She handed it to Dumebi, revealing to her that the woman in the photo was her next target. Dumebi stood there frozen. Her mother never sent her to steal from women, and Dumebi could not understand why her next target was a woman. "She's your next target," Udodi said to Dumebi, who stumbled over her words. "But she's a young woman," Dumebi replied, her confused. "What does she have that we can take?" Udodi leaned in as she began to speak. "She's not just any woman. She's a woman swimming in money. The word on the street is that her father died and left her with all of his fortune, estates, oil wells and several offshore accounts. To crown it all up, she's blind. What will a blind girl be doing with such amounts of money?" she said as she looked at Dumebi with fire in her eyes. "I want you to get close to her, befriend her, make her trust you, earn your way into her life, and when she lets you in, snatch everything." Dumebi's stomach turned at the thought of this. With men, it was always a game, a performance. But this, targeting a blind woman, someone already vulnerable, was something that she never imagined herself doing. "Mama, I don't think I can go through with it." "You don't think, Dumebi?" Udodi snapped. "You do. That's why I trained you. You were born for this. Do you think I crawled through life for nothing? You owe me everything. And the earlier you realize that I can send you to jail with a snap of a finger, you will do as I have instructed." Dumebi stood there shocked to hear her own mother threaten her in such a way. All her life, she has stolen to make her mother happy. Over 15 years of doing her mother's bidding, without any complaint. Dumebi could not believe that her mother was willing to throw her under the bus. She remembered how everything started, how her mother flogged her mercilessly when she refused to steal from their neighbors. She was only 5, but Dumebi could remember it like it was just yesterday. Her mother was so lazy to work. Whilst other mothers went out to fend for their children, her own mother sat in her room strategizing on how, who, and what she wanted her daughter to steal. From pots of soups, to phones left charging in the neighbor's room, to cash tucked inside purses. Dumebi had been stealing before she even understood the meaning of right and wrong. She could still hear her mother's voice from that day. "You think food will fall from heaven? If you don't want to steal, then starve." That was her childhood. One beating after another, one theft after another, one piece of her soul lost each time she took what did not belong to her. By the time Dumebi was 10, she could unlock padlocks without making a sound. By 13, she was already stealing car parts from cars that were parked on the street at night. And by 18, Dumebi was charming men 3 times her age and walking away with their ATM pins. All to please her mother Udodi, who sat there in their home, doing nothing. She was like a tax collector, always demanding her daily cut. Whether it was 10,000 naira or $10 million, Udodi did not care how it was gotten, only that it was delivered. And if Dumebi ever dared to show up empty-handed, she paid with blood, bruises or banishment from the house for days. She wasn't a mother, she was a puppeteer, and Dumebi was nothing more than a prize puppet. She had been a slave to her mother's grief for 15 years, but this time, it wasn't just a man she was being sent to destroy, it was someone like her, a woman who had likely suffered her own kind of pain, a woman who couldn't even see the knife being pointed at her back. Dumebi knew better than to argue with her mother. Her mother was not one to bluff. She had arrested Dumebi on one occasion when Dumebi refused to steal a widow's money. Dumebi spent 3 nights in a police cell, cold, hungry and sick, before her mother came to bail her out, smiling like she had finally taught her a lesson. So without another word, Dumebi took the photo and left. A few days later, she arrived at Adugo's father's mansion. It was a quiet estate in the outskirts of town, surrounded by tall palm trees. Dumebi arrived the mansion, dressed in a simple plain dress, her hair tucked under a scarf as she pretended to just be another humble girl in search of a job. She introduced herself under the fake name Sophia and applied for a role of a live-in carer. With her forged document detailing her vast experience in healthcare and hospitality, as well as her soft voice and perfect reference, Dumebi was shortlisted for the role. Adugo, in her usual quiet way, interviewed her without asking too many questions. "I don't need much," she said softly, revealing that all she wanted was a person who would never treat her like a burden. Dumebi bowed her head slightly, promising Adugo that she could count on her. And just like that, she was in. Dumebi followed their plan judiciously. She cooked, cleaned, read books aloud, and helped Adugo navigate the halls of her beautiful home. She took mental notes of every safe, every drawer, every phone call. She learned the daily routines, the gate codes, the location of the office where financial documents were kept. But what she did not expect was Adugo. Adugo was unlike anyone Dumebi had ever met. Gentle but fierce, quiet but yet wise. She told Dumebi stories of her childhood, the loneliness of being the only daughter of a powerful man, and the loneliness she felt after her father's death. Dumebi could not help but ask how she got blind, and Adugo, though emotional, decided to tell her story. She sat in her favorite chair as she began to speak. "It happened when I was 12, when we just returned from London. My father had just sealed a major deal and could not help but celebrate. We threw a big party and invited several friends who all came to jubilate with us. However, halfway into the party, a huge fire erupted. It was as if someone had deliberately tampered with his gas, causing it to explode. Everyone scampered for their lives, leaving Adugo trapped in her room." Dumebi covered her mouth in horror, as she could not imagine what Adugo had gone through. "My father pulled me out of the fire himself," Adugo continued, her voice steady but laced with sorrow. "But by the time I woke up at the hospital, I could no longer see. The doctors revealed that the fumes from the fire had damaged her eyes completely, and that she had only 20% chance of ever seeing again." Dumebi's heart broke on hearing this. She had come to steal from this woman, a woman who had lost everything in a fire, a woman who had faced death and survived, only to live in darkness ever since. That night, Dumebi could not sleep. She tossed and turned in the guest room, haunted by the sound of Adugo's soft voice retelling her trauma. She stared at the ceiling, asking herself what she was doing. Her mother's face flashed in her mind, reminding her that this was not a time to be soft. She had a mission to accomplish, and going soft would do nothing but bring her disaster. So Dumebi decided to act fast. She crept out of bed and approached the room where all the valuable documents were kept. Dumebi made up her mind to strike. She ransacked the room, trying so hard not to wake Adugo, who was sleeping in the room across. Dumebi moved in with the precision of a trained thief, silent, swift, and focused. Her heartbeat was loud in her chest as she opened drawers, flipped through files, and photographed details of account numbers, property documents, and offshore records. She found what she needed. With trembling hands, she copied the codes and passwords into a small notebook that she hid in her pocket. All she needed now was to slip out quietly, and her job would be done. But as she tiptoed out of the room, she heard the voice, calm, steady, and familiar. "You don't have to do this." Dumebi froze as her heart dropped. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting that of Adugo, who was now standing at the hallway entrance, upright, confident, and staring back at her. Dumebi opened her eyes in shock. "You can see?" she asked Adugo, whose eyes narrowed. "I wasn't completely blind, Dumebi. I lost most of my sight, but over the years some of it returned. I just never told anyone, because people treat you differently when they think you're weak." Dumebi fell to her knees and began to shake. "I'm so sorry. I didn't want to hurt you. My mother, she sent me. I never wanted anything to do with this, but she threatened to arrest me if I refused." Adugo could not believe her ears. "Your mother?" she asked Dumebi, as she tried to wrap her head around the reason why a mother would send her own daughter to steal. Adugo stepped forward as she approached Dumebi, asking for her mother's name. Udodi came. Adugo stared at Dumebi in silence for a long tense moment, her expression unreadable as she requested to meet with her mother. Dumebi began to stammer in a way that she hadn't done before. She could not understand why Adugo was requesting to meet with her mother. She did everything possible to change her mind, promising to pay the price alone, but Adugo was not willing to let go. She insisted on meeting her mother, and Dumebi, left with no other option, took her to her mother's house. The ride to Udodi's house was tense and silent. They arrived at the house a few minutes later, and Dumebi hesitated at the gate. "You don't have to go in," she said quietly, as guilt filled her with fear. Adugo gave her a single glance, insisting on seeing her mother, and Dumebi ushered her into their home. Adugo finally came face to face with Udodi. Udodi froze at the sight of Adugo. She could not understand what Adugo was doing in their home. She turned to look at her daughter Dumebi, who informed her that Adugo insisted on seeing her. Udodi froze at the sight of Adugo, not just because she recognized her face from the photograph, but because she could feel something terrifying behind Adugo's calm stare. She tried to play it off, but deep down, she knew that they were in deep trouble. So she sat down, feigning ignorance, as she asked if Dumebi had done something wrong. Adugo remained silent for a moment, her eyes scanning the woman who had orchestrated her betrayal, the woman who had trained another human being to rob her blind. Her voice was low but firm. "Yes, she did something wrong," Adugo replied her, "but I don't hold her fully responsible." Udodi blinked, confused. "What are you trying to say?" Udodi asked Adugo, who sat across from her and began to speak. "You sent your daughter into my home with forged documents. You trained her to lie, to steal, to pretend to care about me. You sent her to take advantage of my blindness, of my pain, and I would like to understand why." Udodi scoffed and stared at her, crossing her legs. "She's my child. I can raise her however I please." "No," Adugo said. "You don't get to hide behind motherhood. You owe her answers. You owe me answers." Udodi's eyes narrowed as she replied, "And what if I don't feel like giving you any?" Adugo reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She opened a folder and tapped to play a recording. It was a voice note of Dumebi, trembling and crying, recounting everything her mother had done, from the early days of stealing food from neighbors to being jailed by her own mother for disobedience. "Say another word," Adugo said, "and I'll send this to the police. Don't test me. I may have once lost my sight, but I am not stupid," she said to Udodi, who sat there stunned as her lips trembled. "I'm giving you one chance," Adugo continued, her voice low and filled with passion. "One chance to tell the truth. One chance to tell your daughter why you made her into a tool, a weapon. One chance to explain what kind of a mother would trade her daughter's innocence for riches." Dumebi stood off to the side, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief. No one had ever spoken to her mother like this. She stood there and watched as her mother's face drained of color, her gaze finally dropping, and then, like a dam, finally giving way after years of pressure, she spoke. "I didn't have a choice," Udodi said shakily. "I was born poor, on a floor with rats, and grew up stealing bread to feed myself. When I became pregnant for Dumebi, I was barely 15 and worked as a maid for a woman who treated me so badly. Working for her was the most traumatic thing that I had ever done in my life. She gave me food twice a week and made me care for her 6 children alone. So one day, she sent me to the market and I was extremely hungry. I saw a young man who promised to buy me food if I helped him clean his room. He looked terrifying, but my stomach said otherwise. So I accompanied him home and began to clean. A few minutes into the cleaning, the young man forced himself on me. He showed me a gun and said that if I ever tell anyone about it, he would kill me. Once he was done, he kicked me out of his house and shut the door. I returned home and pretended as if nothing happened. Weeks later, the signs of pregnancy began to show, and my madam chased me out of her house, warning that if I ever returned, she would kill me and feed my body to the birds. I was so terrified I had nowhere else to go, so I returned to the house of the man who violated me. What I did not know was that he was a notorious thief in the area. He used me to steal from innocent people around, providing food for me whenever I returned with money. This went on for months, till the police finally shot and killed him. I lived in a small house alone, and finally gave birth to Dumebi, who I fed with stolen money and goods. When Dumebi was now of age, I started to teach her the only life that I had ever known. Not because I hated her, but because I was terrified that the world would do to her what it did to me. I taught her how to steal, how to lie, how to survive, because I thought that that was the only way to protect her. I told myself it was love, that if she had money, no one would ever hurt her like they hurt me. But somewhere along the line, I stopped protecting her and started using her. Udodi's voice broke as she looked at Dumebi, her daughter, standing there in the corner, not as a criminal, not as her golden goose, but as a wounded woman who had been robbed of her innocence. I didn't know how to stop. Udodi whispered. Every time she brought money home, I felt powerful, like I had finally defeated the world that humiliated me. I was addicted to money, to the feeling of control. Tears welled into Maby's eyes. She had cried enough in the darkness of her own room. She had wept while stealing from strangers and smiling at victims, but now she only watched. Adugo remained still. Then she spoke. I asked to meet you, she said softly, not to destroy you, but to understand how a mother could ever turn her own child into a thief. And now I do. Then Adugo stood up. I should press charges against you both, she said plainly, but I won't, because I believe pain that goes unhealed only becomes a cycle. And that's what you are, Udodi, a woman who never healed. Udodi bowed her head in shame. But I promise you, Adugo continued, her voice fierce, if you ever try this again with anyone else, I will become your worst nightmare. Not because I hate you, but because I now know who you really are. She turned to Dumebi. You're free, Dumebi, she said. The door to your cage is open now. Whether you walk out of it or stay, it's your choice. And with that, Adugo turned and walked out of the house. Dumebi stood frozen, her legs trembling as she looked at her mother, the woman who had stolen her childhood, her choices, her soul. Udodi could not meet her gaze. For the first time in her life, the woman who once backed others now sat in silence, drowning in the weight of her own reflection. Tears streamed down to Maby's face, not because she was afraid, but because she finally saw her mother for what she truly was, a broken woman who had also tried to break her. I would have given you the world, Mama, if you loved me, if you had let me be a child, Dumebi said to her mother, who opened her mouth but no words came out. Adugo, who was now standing next to her, reached out and gently held her hands. Let's go, Dumebi, she said as she gave her a reassuring smile. But just as they turned to leave, Udodi's voice cracked through the air. Dumebi, they stopped. I don't deserve forgiveness. I know that now. But please, don't let the pain I gave you be the only thing that you carry from me. For every night you stole from me, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to give back to those I once hurt, starting with you. The room fell silent as Dumebi stood still, tears pouring freely, not just from pain but from release. Without a word, she turned and walked out of the door with Adugo. Months passed, and things began to change. Udodi was no longer the woman who lounged under crystal chandeliers. She now worked at a home for abused girls, her hands scarred from cooking in large pots, her face aged by humility. She never told anyone her past. All she did was let her service speak for her repentance. Dumebi, on the other hand, now living with Adugo, no longer answered to fear. She had started again, slowly, painfully, by working at Adugo's Foundation for the Blind. She didn't just serve, she learned, healed, and gave back to the community that she had once stolen from. And in her own time, she forgave her mother, not because her mother asked, but because she deserved to live a life not bound by her mother's chains. The lesson to be learned from this story is that pain can shape us, but it should never define us. True strength lies not in survival through cruelty, but in choosing healing over hatred, love over vengeance, and freedom over fear. The chains of generational trauma can be broken, not by revenge, but by courage, compassion, and the willingness to become more than what the world tried to make you. I hope you enjoyed the story.